This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so this is our November genealogy meeting. Okay. I assume that this is better, Helen. Okay. Okay. Two quickies. First one, no meeting in December. Okay, because that's Christmas. Second one, the meeting in January is on religious records. All right, with that in mind, our guest today is Wendy Wheelwright. Wendy's been with us before to talk about adoption, and today we're going to talk about German. For those of us who have some German ancestry that isn't as, well, actually probably is as complicated as we think it is. Wendy's background is she sort of runs through three different aspects of life. One of them is her genealogy world, where she does all the German stuff, particularly down at the Family History Center. The other one is she is works for the County of Sonoma in the Behavioral Health Department, but that's sort of like her other job. But the real job is she's also a personal, you do personal, whatever you call it, private therapy. Okay, yeah. Okay, and teaches occasionally. And she's also an opera singer. So with all that in mind, here's Wendy.
Yeah, I don't like free time, turns out. So I tend to fill it with really fun things like genealogy. Is that too soft? I can use my opera voice. It projects much better. I will do that. Is this good volume? Okay. I'm seeing heads nodding on Zoom. That's a good sign. All right. No, I was just joking. I don't like free time, which is why I have 3 jobs and 2 really full-time hobbies. But genealogy is definitely my favorite addiction. It is really fun to fall down that rabbit hole all the time. I speak, well, it's more that I read German scripts really well. I do speak it decently because I was married to one. And it's only fair that my husband be able to argue in his own language, you know, and so we have that understanding that he's allowed to do that. So what I was planning to talk about today, which I need to activate my screen here, is, you know, where to start, how to get across the pond, because that's one of the trickiest parts of researching Germanic languages. If we can close that, I think that would help. And then also talk about some of the tips and tricks for deciphering the old scripts, things I've run into over the years in trying to navigate that. So I always start with what people know and work backwards. Somebody might remember where we're from in the old country. And I need to know that. What's the town name? Does anybody remember the town name? Is what I'm going for. That's where I always, yes. And so, and then I interview people who might actually remember that. And then I check census records because they'll often give country of origin, sometimes a little more specifically state. They might list Bohemia, they might list Silesia or Galicia. Before I start digging into actual vital records, immigration records are gold if I can find them, especially if they came through Ellis, because it will often give the name of the relative and where from the country of origin, and I can use that as a tracking point. I work with other people on this, and I document. When I'm working on trees that are posted online, I try to document my sources as best as possible in case some other poor soul is wandering down that same rabbit hole and I can save them time. So this is my general plan of attack when I'm going after German research. It's really important to learn as much as possible about kind of the person who came across, get to that stop point, that block point, and try to figure out what other names have they gone by? What dates do we have approximations on? Can I narrow down the place? And do I know any relatives? Because often, not just the person came, but a family might come together or the neighborhood. So sometimes I'll be researching the neighbors because villages might come together and locate in the same spot. And so that's another way to kind of backtrack in. I don't know about you, but I have an awful lot of Johans in the tree, or France, or Mariana. Forget about it. But when I can find Alois or Ignaz or Ambrosius, yes, I can find that one. So I try to find the weird names in the neighborhood and track them. You had a question.
I have a question.
I'm sorry, there's a question in the room. Give me 1 second. Yes. Correct. It's very common to go by the middle name and have everybody named Johann or Maria. That is correct. And then there was a question online. Please go ahead.
Well, I think you may have answered it, because my ancestor comes from the Palatinate and is listed as Johann parentheses Jakob. And we always knew that his name was Jakob, but the Johann just showed up, and now you've explained why.
Yeah.
Everybody's Johann. So they translated, they just picked another name or something like that?
No, they typically had two middle names. So a lot of German birth records will have a first, second, and third name because they actually went by the second and third name. And the first name was the Johann or the Maria that was coming. So I want to identify as much as possible around this person I'm searching for, so that when I do locate Johann, who lives in Silesia, I can tell which one it is from the other antecedent records. All right, so other family members help me tell apart the families with the same first names. Now, if you're unlucky like me, I actually was tracking a line in Braslovitz where the Johann Schelige married Ludwina Liss. And I thought, okay, Ludwina is unique enough that I'll be able to figure that out. And then there's a bunch of kids happening. And then I found two marriage records a year apart between a Johann Schelige and a Ludwina Liss in the same town with different parentage of said parties. And they lived near each other and had kids at the same time. And it wasn't until I realized they were having kids 3 months apart. I'm like, wait, there's two couples. And they literally are named the same thing. And they live in the same town at the same time, which should be illegal. But they did that. And it took me a while to figure out. At one point, I was going through the birth records. I had to do it by the occupation because they had different occupations. So that's how I could tell them apart. In fact, one of them would call him Johann 1, Johann 2. Like one of the priests was having the same trouble telling them apart, started naming him that way. So I can't tell the kids. And of course, they named all their kids the same names too. Like, thanks for that. So just little things that happen where you're like, okay, I need to figure out the siblings and the spouses and the parents so that I know which family's which. Friends and neighbors tended to travel together. So often, especially if there's godparents or witnesses listed on birth or marriage records, these are going to be close family friends potentially. So I'll often keep track of those because I'll see the same people showing up together on both sides of the pond. And then, you know, there's the good old fashioned family stories. Despite the tendency toward exaggeration that is part of all of ours, there are elements of truth to them. And so they may actually know the town we came from. What religion was the family? Even if they're not now, different parts of Europe had different predominant religions. So whether it's Catholic or Lutheran or Jewish, or there's different regions where that would be more dominant and more likely to have been from. So then I got to follow the breadcrumbs. What I'm trying to get to is the place of origin. But I need to identify some of these other things in order to get me there. So the secondary goals on this list are the other things that get me there. Usually a census, if it's old enough, starts to list immigration dates. So that'll give me a clue as to where to look. Do I know where they departed from? Do I know where they arrived to? Because there's going to be different records in both those places that have different pieces of information that might be important. Do I know anything about the ship itself? Who else came aboard that ship and went with them? How did they know them? Where did they all land and end up? And eventually, if I'm lucky and get some good records out of that, I might find their original country or region. Okay. Please. Now, one of the trickiest pieces is what was their name before they immigrated? In my family line, there's a surname called Swope. Doesn't sound very German. Because I think in German it's Allerstadt, which sounds nothing like swamp. So, but what happened was, they're from Schwabia, from Schwaben. And when they got here and they didn't speak any English and they went through Ellis and the person asked them what their name was, they said, where are you from? Because in German, wo is where, whereas in English, who is who are you? And so they said Schwaben, which the person wrote down as Swope. That was close enough. And that became their last name going forward. So sometimes things happen at the entry point to the last names. In the age of DNA genealogy, there have been some interesting finds there in order to hook up and link up the surnames and what happened to them. But oftentimes the family will know the story of what happened to the name. It'll be somewhere. And so just notice that that happens. Names can sometimes change. Last names can change dramatically. First names almost always change. They'll be Americanized, and they will not match what was in the legacy record. This is particularly true if you're doing Jewish genealogy. Most of those records are going to be in German in the country of origin. But the Hebrew name is going to be different than the common name, sometimes vastly different. Chaim could be Hermann, but it can also be Charles. So it's, so again, this is things where, what are the family kind of traditional names that are being passed down along those lines? And that can help me kind of connect to what it might be. All right, so just reviewed that part. I try to figure out the town. And once I'm getting an idea of the town, then I'm going to start looking at various places. I'm a big fan of place search on Family Search, kind of old school way of doing it, but I often will do that to see what records are from that area. If I can find church records, golden. Then I can start digging in and actually approximate down to the dates and start looking hand by hand. A lot of them are more indexed now, but there's still a lot that aren't. They're hard to read. And so as indexing projects go, those tend to go a little slower. And I do a lot of correcting of what is indexed on those records when I read them later. So examples of that. Now let's talk about the tricky stuff. There are lots of places in a record which might give what sounds like a place name, and it's not really a town, it's a county or a state. And it's hard for us to know that on this side when we're not familiar with the area. Does that make sense? And so if it says they're from Bavaria, that's not a town, that's a big place. That doesn't exactly narrow down the town I should be looking at. That just gives me the state. And so sometimes a regional name is used in an immigration record instead of the actual town. And so I'll try to trace it back to the port of departure, because they might have actually given the town name when they exited, as opposed to when they landed. And then spelling is, as a consistent thing, is like an optional practice in records. Spelling is completely optional. There's all kinds of creativity around what happens to town names, last names, first names, spelling wise. So don't be afraid to look at something just because it's not quite right. If it's close, take a look, see. And then what I tend to do is once I find a possible, I have to try to prove they really are the one I want. And I tend to prove it by attempting to disprove it. If I find 3 different Johann Scheligas, for instance, I'm going to search death records and see which ones died as children. Okay, they're out. You know what I mean? I try to disprove that this is my guy as many ways as possible until we finally get it narrowed down if I can't find the exact pinpoint. So does that make sense to everybody so far? How we get to this point? Okay. So can you see that map? That is modern day Ukraine. Lemberg is Lviv in Ukrainian. But when it was Galicia, the maps were in German and they looked like that. So depending on how old the records are you're looking at, the names of the cities will have changed to what they are now. So if you just Google map it, you're not going to find that city. So what I do is I Google old map it. So I'll actually put in maps from Silesia 1800 to get an actual maps designed at the time, or Galicia, or what have you. Myers Gazetteer is a really good resource for that. They have a lot of older maps for German regions, and will let you do a sounds like search. You can put in the name as you see it, and they go, we didn't find anything. Do you want to search for something that's close? I'm like, absolutely. And then it gives me the list of could be these, and I can start looking around. Myers Gazetteer. Myers, Meyers, Gazetteer, online resource. They have maps that look like that, and they're beautiful, and you can zoom in on them and see what the town names were called back then. Very helpful. If you're looking for Jewish villages, Städtelfinder on jewishgen.org is a great resource. Those towns probably also change names, but they will give you the whole history, like the name in multiple languages, so that you can find that. And there's a website called Index to German Polish Names that I use. I just Google German Polish place names, and it's the first one that always comes up on Google. I love that one. And I can just type in the one I know, and then it gives me what it's called now, or vice versa, and just search around for that. But the borders moved. There were a few wars in that region. Depending on when you're searching, the language the record is in could be in Polish, German, or Latin, or all three at the same time. That's fun. When it's written in Latin with German names and Polish endings, I'm like, are you trying to kill me? Is that what's happening right now? And so I spend a lot of time in really old maps because I need to understand the town, but the neighboring towns and what they were called at the time. So here's some common problems. The country is not called Germany, it's called Deutschland. So there's going to be the names of things in the language that aren't what we call them. Also, regional terms can often be mistaken for place names, especially in the indexing projects. So sometimes I'll see a record that was indexed as Ostprussia, as the town. I'm like, that's not a town. And you'll go in and look at the actual record, and it's the town you wanted. And so just know that that's a thing in a lot of the online databases. They did their best on indexing, but there's quite a few mistakes around understanding the difference between regional and town name, and people indexing that as the actual city. So Königsreich Preußen is the Kingdom of Prussia. It's not the town called Königsreich in Prussia. And so that kind of thing happens where I see Kreis, which means district or county, a lot as part of a place name. And I'm like, no, that's county. You're saying they live in county. That's probably not going to help me find them. Or powiat in Polish. Also, the town name itself could have a different spelling natively, like München or Munich, for instance. So there's going to be different variants of spellings depending on whether you're looking at a record over here or over there. And there's many records that only give the regional name, like Sachsen or Saxony, and they don't actually give the town name. They're just saying they're from this region. So census records typically only give the region a person's from, American census records. And I have to do a little more sleuthing to get it down to town. Now this one's tricky. You might have someone who's from Baden. Baden is both a town and a very large region. And so is Hanover. That is a town in a very large region. And typically, when I see Baden or Hanover in a record, they're referring to the region, not the town. Typically, a person gives the largest city they live near because that's the one people will know, right? So if I live in Glen Ellen, somebody asks me where I'm from, I might say Santa Rosa because it's the biggest thing near me. For someone outside, they did that too. And so I'm from Baden, may not be the actual city of Baden. It may be one of the little tiny Dinkeldorfs outside of Baden that's close enough, and that's the only thing you would know. And then port cities. The port I came out of is most likely not the town I'm from, but it will be what's listed on a lot of records. And so I'm like, oh, when someone gets really excited, oh, I found out my family's from Hamburg. I'm like, ooh, that's a major port. Are you sure they're from Hamburg? Or did they leave from Hamburg? Because everybody left from Hamburg or Bremen or one of these other ones. And so let's go find the records in Hamburg when they left and see what it says they're from, because that might be more specific. All right. I can't do a PowerPoint without at least one cat picture. So there's my one. Yes. I put this one up there because, and again, there ought to be a law, but there are so many towns with the exact same name in the same country. There's 14 towns in Germany and lots of hamlets named Schernau. Lots of them. So Britain has 57 places named Mount Pleasant, right? So there's just, so sometimes I get it down to an actual town. I'm like, yes. And then I realize, oh no, which one of those? Because they might be in wildly different places. So then I try to figure out, that's when the regional information is very helpful. Oh, there's only one of them in Silesia. Okay, then it's that one. Cool. And then, of course, I mentioned wars changed the names. Gdansk and Danzig, same place, different language, and so forth. So there's lots of those, and they don't have a lot of commonality necessarily. I can see Gdansk and Danzig. There's a lot of sounds in common between those two names, but Breslau and Wroclaw, wouldn't have guessed that one. Those are actually the same place. And then in, this is fun. So as you all know, in German, the J is pronounced yeah, like we pronounce our Y. And the Y in German is pronounced E, unless you get to old enough records, and then it's an I. Chick, CZYK on the end of a word. And they actually start using it the more like we use it currently. English and German split at one point. And when you get old enough, they're much more in common. They use the C for Carl instead of the K. They, so the older records start approximating our spellings more closely. But that can be confusing if you're used to the more contemporary spelling and you're going backwards and suddenly all the names change in that way. Was your hand up? Yes. You would be surprised. Yeah. I will show you a few things. It depends which script you're looking at. So I'm going to give you some pointers on, the first time I looked at Zutterland script, I cried because I could see the last name I was looking for. It was on the very first record I pulled. I was stunned and I could read nothing else on it. And I cried. I couldn't even read the first name. So it took me a while to kind of get that, but then your eye starts to become familiar with how it looks. Just like when we become acquainted with someone we know is really lousy handwriting, but we love them. So we learn to decipher the scribble. It's like that. I love these ancestors and I start deciphering their scribble. But there's a couple letters that are commonly misconstrued. And this is helpful for searching when it's an indexed record. The W and the M look very similar. And so I've seen a lot of misspelled surnames that have W's and M's on the front of them. And I'll just reverse that in my search to see if I find it. I'll anticipate the person spelled it wrong in the index. The K and the R look identical. The K is much more common, but in English, the R is much more common. So we tend to see it as an R when we index it. And so there's a lot of mess in the last names around that too. So I will intentionally search for very misspelled versions of the surname, knowing these little things that tend to happen. Does that follow? Okay. Also, diacritical marks tend to be omitted in transcriptions. Those are the umlaut dots. So sometimes they'll spell the A umlaut as AE, and sometimes it's just A. And sometimes the search engines don't know how to figure that out. So I'll put both versions when I'm searching to see what it does with that. All right, so since we're talking about ugly handwriting, I'm going to start really old. This is Gothic. This is old. So you're going to be looking at records from quite far back and probably going to be in Latin, actually, when I'm reading this. So one of the things I do is I ask the internet to show me pictures of comparisons of these handwritings. And I keep all these up next to me while I'm going through the one I'm doing to try to figure out which one can I definitively say, okay, that's an A. All right, that must be an S. This is, and so I can start to get used to that priest's handwriting. Does that follow? So if we're going to look at that, just on the A row alone, the one that looks like a 2, I see that one a lot. And in later scripts, that's more like a Q. And so, and you can see on the right, there's different examples of handwriting of these names, you know, Christian, Christina, Christoph, and they're giving different examples of how that looks. And so I start to try to find the given name, like examples of the given name I'm interested in online in that script, so I can get used to what it looks like, so that I can find it on the page. I don't have to be able to read German per se, or even Latin to find the name. I need to know what order the record tends to go in. And it tends to go in the order of this kid, the father, the mother, and so forth. And so if I understand the sequencing of the record, then I can follow that same pattern and figure out what's going on, even if I don't speak the language very well, even if I can't figure out the connector words. But figuring out the name is the hardest part, because of this, because the capital letters, which are the ones used least commonly, are the ones I'm trying to decipher to figure out the first name. And so I keep these kinds of things to try to figure it out. Now, I put this one up so I can show you the B. See that first B that looks kind of like an L? This one, this very first one, that's a capital B. And you know that because it has the little loop up to the top that does that. So it connects back. That's how they did the B. That looks like an L to my brain. When I look at that, it looks like an L. And so knowing that, I often will search index records, substituting the L for the B and vice versa, knowing that somebody probably made that mistake too. On the right, oh, those are C's. Those are Christian, Christina. Yeah, yeah, that's all right. So that's what I do. I'm looking for Hans. What does Hans look like in this script? And I ask the internet, what does Hans look like in this script? And it will give me examples. That's helpful, right? Yeah, so I do a lot of that. And then I kind of keep little samples like this and lists that do comparisons until I figure out, okay, in this person's handwriting, that's definitely a T. Okay, got it. Because it takes a minute. All right, this is Fraktur. This is a typeface. I want to show you. Okay, let me see if I can do it here. Can you see my mouse? Oh, you can. Okay. All right. There's I'm gonna move my pictures out of the way over here. Okay. There is a this top letter here. This is Zeugnung. This is a Z. This one. This one on the side. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving right here. That's a B. Bleh. This is a V. Versuch. That's why I'm showing you that. Do you notice how similar those are? This one's open and that one's got a line. That's the only difference. And I just lost my mouse. Okay, that's whoop. It's not like what I'm doing. So that's type. That's typeface. So the handwriting for this script is similar to this. And so they're similar, kind of the B's and the V's get messed up. Now, I remember how I said the W and the M looks very similar. Down here on the bottom, this is V and this is mine. This is the W and that's the M. Now I can see they're different. That one is the loop on the bottom. This one's open. That's a very small difference. I mean, they look really similar, right? So like, the other one, then that's just the capitals. Let's go lowercase for a minute because that's fun. You can probably see the I and the E and the D and the E and the R pretty easily and interpret that this must be Vita. That's a W, not an M. Whoops, that's Sutherland. We don't want to look at that. Ugh. All right, but here's a fun one. This is the word früh, which is early. That's an F, but this is Z. That's an S. Don't they look kind of the same? This one, the line's a little more pronounced, but there is a hint of a line on the S in the older scripts. So this is einst, that's an S here. That makes sense. Dunst. This is Fraktur. This is Fraktur script. Yeah. And so I see this script a lot in some of the older records around 1700s. I tend to see this script. Even the typeface of it is sometimes hard to decipher because of these similarities. And if this is what the typeface looks like, you can imagine what the handwriting does. Yes, I'm taking them in sequence as they get closer to present time. The hardest script to read is the next one I'm going to show you. And even though it's more recent, there was a period in Germany where this gentleman, named Zuderman, for whatever reason, convinced everybody we should just have an entirely different way of writing the alphabet than every other country. And they did. And so this is the result of that. This is really good Zuderland handwriting, actually. This is the first record I pulled, not this record, but this script is what I pulled up the first time I read a record and I couldn't read it and cried because I had no idea what I was looking at. So I had to get online and ask, what does Zuderland look like? What do these words look like in this script? So I could get to know the letters because my brain breaks them at different points. So to give you an example of why this one's a little tricky, this is the word con. This is the K. Doesn't it look like an R? That's a K. The A is an open loop and then a separate line down. There's a space there. This whole thing is the A. This is con. This is double N. This says Lehrpersonen, Lehrpersonen. Over time, I've gotten to where I can read that easily, but that took me a minute for this one. And so if you have records in this, take some time to find a really good one-to-one on it. I noticed you have one on the front of your binder because this one is a hard script to read. And notice that if somebody is gonna, here, this right here is Kinder, K-I-N, that's a D. This is the loop, you see it? This is E-R. But if I didn't know what I was looking at and I tried to index that word, I might think that's an R. I would probably correctly determine that that's an I. But seeing this mess, I might think that's an M and that's an L, and I might not know what these two are. I might think that's an S and not understand that's the R. This is actually Kinder, children. Does that make sense? So when I'm mindful of not only this is hard for me, but this is hard for other people to read. And whoever had made the attempt to transcribe this possibly didn't know what they were looking at either. And so sometimes you're going to see some really weird misspellings of surnames based on how the letters are next to each other. The fact that the N and the D look like ML because our eyes used to spacing it differently. We're used to a D connecting on the top. We're used to the A connecting on the top. And in Zuderland script, they leave them open like that. And my brain always thinks that's two different letters, but it's not. Okay, so this one's fun down here. You see this big mess? That actually says gymnasium. That's a G. I'm sure you could figure out the G, but I doubt you knew that was a Y. Kind of looks like a Z. And then this, okay, I had a stroke while I was writing. No, actually that 3 of those is an M, 2 of them's an N. This is actually the A. There's the S, I, the U, because you can't tell it apart from the N. They put the little loopy on top of, so you can tell it's a U because they're the exact same shape as the N. So they always do the little foot, and that's how you know it's a U. And there's an M on the end. This one took me a minute. I was like, what is that? And so it's just, the spacings are wonky, is what it is, okay? So this is a note from the teachers to the parents of these children going to school, is what this is saying. And, you know, Lehrpersonen verhindert, and then it says, Ich kann den Eltern die Kinder für deren Vorbildung bis zu einer gewissen Klasse am Gymnasium an Ober. So that's, you can get to where you can actually read it. it just takes a minute to get my brain to go, that's not right. That's not how that should look. And sometimes in even records that are written in this script, all of the in between text will be written in this script, and then the names will be written in an older script that's easier to read, because even they knew nobody could read this. And so sometimes you'll be able to pull the names out, but not like, what is this stuff in between? I'm like, it's that. That's the problem. Yes. Oh, for Zuderland, late, when did that come around? 1800s, kind of halfway through into 1900s a little bit, actually. I see it, even some more current stuff, and then they finally stopped. So there will be, a person would have to have been, there's very few living Germans that can read this script now, because they won't have learned it in school anymore, but some of the older generation can still. Fraktur is like 1700s. It's quite old. Yeah. All right. So this is current. That top version is real messy handwriting, but I often see really messy handwriting like that. It's all kind of slanted. And so I keep copies of current around so I can decipher those when I see them. This is used in multiple countries, not just Germany. So sometimes I'll see even English records looking more like that. And so I brought this one, even though the words here are actually in English. These are all like spices and foods. Brought this one so we could look at the, do you see the W and the M? Yeah, same problem. So that seemed to just happen in every version of the script, where those are easy to get messed up. Right. So I have shown you enough things to scare you. And I thought I would make some time for questions since I'm here. Yes. Oh, sorry. The Zoomies can't hear you if we don't put you on mic.
Since I'm deaf. Okay, you've been talking about different things, the scripts, the maps, and
Yeah.
various other things. And how do you, where are they online? I mean, that's always the question, is how do you find where these records might be for a township or whatever? Because, you know, I use Ancestry, I use Little Family Search, I use
Mhm.
different things, and it's not there. Some things are, but not
So
county records, if you will.
I tend to find the immigration records on Ancestry. I'm accustomed to looking for those there. And that'll give me an idea of what the place name is. If I already know what the place name is, then I actually tend to start with Family Search and just, instead of going through the search, like the record search, I actually go search catalog, and then I go place name and I put the place name in because I want to see what's available in that location. Yeah. And so I'll go down as narrow as I can, and it'll say nothing. And then I back it up one. You know, so if it's Grzybowicz, which is a little teeny tiny dwarf that's part of Wiszowa, it's not going to find anything with that name, but it is going to find Wiszowa. And Grzybowicz is part of that. And so then I'll look, well, what's in Wiszowa? It's like, oh, a bunch of stuff. Okay, let me go there. And so then from there, I can actually pull it up. It's the old like film ordering system, and it's still live. Can't order the films, but you can see what's on them. And you can see which ones are searchable with a magnifying glass as an index, and which ones aren't, but they've got a little camera and I can look at them. So even if it's not something that's been indexed yet that I can search, that doesn't mean it isn't there. If it's got a little camera on it, I can go look at it, and I will. And so I'll just pull it up and go, okay, well, I know roughly what date range I'm looking for. I'm just going to grind through it, see if I can find stuff. And I tend to do, you know, I tend to do about 2 to 5 years front and back of things, because it turns out people lie about their age in all centuries. that's, that's a thing. And so they're like, no, we have the exact date on the gravestone. I'm like, and who gave it to you? Not the person who died. So, but yeah, so I'll go, kind of front and back of it to see. And I'm just looking for, am I even finding that surname in that town? And if I'm finding a bunch of that surname, ooh, we might have a live one here. If I find none of that surname, okay, I'm in the wrong town. I need to go to another town nearby.
Wendy, the wikis are pretty good for some areas. Are they good for Germany?
Yeah, they're real good. Yeah, the wikis will have oh boy, they have like what oh yeah, this is fun. So numbers. Some people handwrite them. They don't write 21, they spell 21, handwritten, no numbers for the date, which is fun when you can't read the script. You're like, what does that say? And so they have, the wikis have the list of how the numbers could be spelled out or abbreviations for them. It's rude to abbreviate a record in another language that I can't read. That's just rude. So they'll give you ideas of the abbreviations. Like VH means phone here, from here. So sometimes instead of saying where they're from, they just say from here, VH. Took me forever to realize what that meant. And so, and it'll give things like common professions, which is at the time, which is super helpful because they're not called that now. So if you just do Google Translate on what looks like a profession, you might not find what it really is. So I like the wikis for that because they'll give me the professions, like common holidays, things like that, that might be in a record. That on the Family Search has wikis for each area you're researching. Thank you, George.
Yep.
That's okay.
When you go onto Family Search and you look at the geography, there's an initial map of the world. You just start clicking down. Eventually you get to Germany, and then you'll get to the different states.
Yes.
Yeah. And then, and then as you make your way down, each of those has a long list of possible places you can look. Okay. And I don't do German, do a lot of Poland. And there are increasingly some websites now that are done by people in Poland that have town records and church records, and they have a choice. You can have it in English, or you can have it in Polish. Needless to say, I tend to avoid the Polish.
I'm getting better at Polish. I spent enough time reading it that I'm starting to be able to navigate it. But I particularly researched Silesia, which is right, the border moved a lot in that region. So it's modern day, right where the Czech Republic, Poland, and Germany meet, is that region. And so depending on what time period you're in, it's going to be in German or Polish or Latin. And so even if you're researching in Poland, you're most likely to be seeing German records for a good portion of it, going pretty far back, because Prussia was huge. It was the whole region. So
I want to go back to one thing you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
I have found that Jewish gin, when you get to the alternative town names in
Yes.
different languages, okay, can be quite valuable.
Yes.
My wife's grandfather came over, one of his brothers came over, and they had two different towns. I mean, they were just completely different. But that was because one was in Polish and one was in Jewish.
Yep. So also kind of like phonetic sounding in German, AU is au and OW is ov. So if I have a town BORONOW, Boronov, or NOV is what we now, Boronov. But in English, that would look like Boronau, right? But Boronau would be spelled with an AU on the end in actual German. And so when I see somebody say, well, we're from Boronau, I'm like, or just Bornau is what they told me they were from. That took us forever to figure out that was Boronov. But I looked first for Boronau and Bornau and AU to see if it was phonetic, if that's what it was, if it's the sound of it, or if they were spelling it right and we had changed the sound of it just because we're pronouncing it that way. Does that make sense? So sometimes one has to get a little creative and trying to figure out what was that. town.
Any questions online, just unmute yourself and ask away. Um, Let's go back.
I-
We got one.
Go.
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, it's moving. Okay, I was having a little trouble with mute and stuff like that. My question, Wendy,
Mhm.
goes back to when you were doing the names. Was there a time when you go back in history when everybody did not have a full set of names? For
Yes.
example, in Holland, they only had first names up until Napoleon.
Yes. In Germany, it does go to patronymic naming eventually. Patronymic meaning son of or daughter of. It's farther back than Denmark. Denmark, they still actually did patronymics until fairly recently in terms of genealogy records. You have to go. I start seeing that like late 1600s is where I start to see that shift, right, kind of on the turn there, where it'll be looking at a record, and her name was Hedwig, and the last name is Balthasar. Balthasar is not a very German last name, but it's a very German first name. And so that was the name of her father. That was his given name. And so that became her surname. And that carried forward in her records in the early 1700s. And then surnames were sticking by then. So there's a point, it depends on the region. So I have to kind of look at the history of whatever one region is in. There's a point at which either civilly or religiously, there's a declaration that you have to do a surname, and it's different in different parts of the world as to when that took place. It was much earlier in a lot of the German-speaking regions before you run into patronymics. But if it's a Hebrew community within a German-speaking region, they kept patronymics much longer. And then the state mandated it that they had to pick surnames. So there will be a point at which those records all change. And it might be the same person. So not sure if any of you are researching those lines, but as they're often in German languages, I tend to assume yes. And so patronymic naming there can get tricky. And also, if you are researching a line that was not part of the dominant religious persuasion of the region that you're in, there may be some interesting prejudices show up in the records. So as an example, if you're not Catholic, in Poland, the priest would record all the births as illegitimate. Mm-hmm. And so they would record the mother's name and the surname of the mother on the child, and then there'd be a note saying, oh, and she lives with this man, who was actually the father, and a different surname. And so because they wouldn't recognize the marriage because it wasn't in the church. Does that make sense? So you'll see that regionally, and depending on what the dominant religion is in various areas, you'll see sometimes if they're recording, because often the church is who recorded all of the births of the region, not just their own denomination. But if you weren't part of their denomination, they would record it differently, depending on the town. And so just know that that might be a thing that you run into occasionally.
Heck, that's Virginia in the 1700s. If you were not Church of England, okay, you would happen to be Baptist, your marriage was not recognized.
Right.
What about if your family came over prior to 1840, where you're not talking about the quality of records that we tend to be talking about for the later periods?
I can hear someone not muted and making a lot of
Somebody can remute themselves.
See if you can. Hey, Janet, can you mute? Thank you.
Sorry.
No problem. So if they're coming over much earlier, you're not going to get a place name out of the immigration record. You're going to be lucky if there even is an immigration record. And so this is going to be a weird place to look, but you'd be surprised how far back newspapers go. town little something somethings. And I have found some little golden nuggets because they had a tendency to announce the comings and goings of the area. And so I sometimes would find little nuggets there that give you a clue as to where people are coming from. And then also, that's when I do spread out and I'm kind of researching all the neighbors too. Like, where did they all come from? What's the history of the town? Sometimes the town will have a history, like a written history of the town. And it'll talk about the influx of Hessians at da-da-da. You know, well, that's when my person came. Shoot, I wonder if they're Hessian. Okay, and so then that becomes a clue as to that as well. So if it's much further back and we don't have really good port of entry records, then newspapers are a surprising find for me. Just the little nuggets there, but also like town histories, family books, that kind of thing. Name patterns. Yeah, well, the name patterns for sure, although, well, that can be a clue once I'm in the older records across the pond to say, oh, look, it's all the same identical given names. Unless that name is Johann. Don't trust that. But yeah.
Well, I have a sort of a different problem. I have lots and lots of information about towns, names, history, tons. And I have hundreds of letters written by my grandparents. And they're very, very important letters because they were either being arrested by the Nazis or hiding. And I really want to try and get them translated. I'm way too old to be able to translate hundreds of letters that are long and on onion skin. And do you have any suggestions? I've paid for some translations, but it's sort of hit or miss, you know. The only thing I can think of is finding dates that coincide with certain timelines and just reducing the number of letters that I want translated to maybe 100 or so, but it still costs a fortune and I can't do it. Is there any other solution to that?
There's one I can think of, but it's still being developed. But they are applying artificial intelligence toward reading old scripts and translating. So a lot of the translation platforms online now use that, and they do a much better job. If you remember the early days of Google Translate, it would just do a literal translation without respect to grammar. So if you tried to speak that to someone who was German, they would look at you like you're having an aneurysm because that didn't make any sense. But now the tech on that is far more advanced. It's doing a much better job of actually learning the language and learning the idioms and things like that. And so, and doing a pattern recognition, doing a visual recognition on, so you can teach it almost like you would teach Dragon Speak to follow your voice. It can be taught to read a handwriting. So that might be a way to do it. I haven't researched if there's apps developed on that yet. I'll bet there are.
What I meant by that is you mentioned the family hiding from Nazis. Okay.
At the time. Okay.
Deborah, you had a question.
There we go. I'm just joining a little late and I'm actually just starting my search. My family is German, but originally from, with the maps being different, originally from Prussia. And I'm wondering if that being the case, if there's a different approach.
No, it would be the approach, which means you probably missed the slide where I talked about how all the names changed and that's a little bit rough. Prussia is a very, very large region. And so the first thing is to try to narrow that down into its component areas. Because Prussia would include Silesia, but Ostprussia and Opolna and all kinds of other places. And so, so we'd want to kind of try to narrow that a little bit so that we can get an idea of the exact region that you're coming from. And then start looking at those older maps to see how things changed. So that most of the search engines, at least Ancestry and Family Search, you can place search under both the Polish and the German town names, and they've linked them pretty well. And
Okay.
so, yeah, so you should be okay there. But once in a while, I run into one where it's like, I don't know what this is. So then I have to go research on Google, or I use the Myers Gazetteer for that a lot to figure out what was it called in German, what is it now, and it'll give the whole kind of summary of that and a little map of the area. I could demo that if you guys want me to do that. I can show you what that looks like. Would that be helpful?
I should mention that I've used Steve Morse for both alternative spellers and for people who come from villages. I've been very successful at putting the name of a village in and finding out what people immigrated through Ellis Island who came from that village. You can do that search. No names, just put the name of the village in.
Okay.
And if you want to find the alternatives for a particular name that you think makes sense, one of the things they've spent a lot of time on is what are the alternative names that have the same conceptual background.
All right, so I'm going to put in I'm going to put in Vishoa because I know it's going to be in there. And it'll come up with a list of possibles. Now there's one that's spelled exactly that way because I happen to know how it's spelled. If I had not spelled it that way, it said I can't find that. But do you want to do a sounds like search? And then it will pull up more things that it might be. Okay. So this is Vishova, Kreisis County, Tarnowitz. But then it gives me the whole thing, Opolna, Silesia, Prussia. So there's the whole, and this is what it was, village and land state at the time. It'll also give you like different variants of that. If I click on this, then it goes to here, and it gives you kind of like, okay, here's what it is now. Here's some example of it in old script. This is us finding it in things. And this is the part I care about, the map. Now this looks like a modern Google map, but look at it. It's not. This is an old map of what it looked like then. Oh, and I can zoom on this thing and drag it around. And so one of the things that's interesting to me to look at a map at the time, let me zoom in a little bit, is, okay, where were the main roads going? You know, because if somebody was from nearby, where nearby would they likely be? What direction is the travel common to? Oh, these are the roads, these are the ways they go. So going, you know, how hard is it to get to some other places? And so I happen to love this site because it lets me see what things are called. Now in this region, let me see if I can find one that's doing that. In this region, sometimes, oh yeah, here we go. It will give you, this is the name of like the train station, that's Bahnhof. So this one's purposely giving it to me in German. But some of these are, sometimes it'll give you both. It'll say, because the name is in the process of changing, so it'll give me the German name, and then it will give me, it'll say P underneath it and give another name, and that's in Polish. Or it'll give me the Polish name and then have, you know, the German underneath it. So sometimes you'll see that happening on all sides. But for me, this is very helpful because these towns, while this one is still called what it's called, the rest of these are not. And so it helps me to realize, oh, so when the record's here, but some of them say they're from Rokitnitz, which is down here, but Michovitz is over here, and there's a bunch of Rokitnitz records over here because it's dead in between them, and these are the two big churches to record them, and they didn't have one, and so they either went this way or they went that way, and sometimes they flip-flop depending which kid it was. So that's helpful for me to know, oh, this is the main drag, and they're going to go one way or the other way for where the record is. Does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, that's a great question.
That's great. Thank you.
That is a great question. I'm sorry. She's asking, how do you know where the churches are? Which towns have them? Couple ways to know that. One is Wikipedia of the town itself, its history, because they'll start to tell you what the nearest big things are that it was belonged to. So that's one way that I figure that out. Another way, I just stop this share because I have to do a different one to show it to you. So I like to save old maps. Let me see. It's not the map I want. Oh, it's in pictures. That's why. I'm in documents. Okay, let me get into his. Oh, really nice. That's a good one. It'll take me a minute to load this because it's kind of a big map. Okay. Now I need to share it so you guys can see it. This is Principality of Silesia in the 1700s. Let me see that. Okay. That's quite, I can't read that this far zoomed out. It's real pretty though. The great region I'm interested in though happens to be down here. And if I zoom this bad boy in, you can see how detailed it is. They drew in the trees for the forests. Okay, so if I go into where I just was, there's Vishava. Remember that? We were just looking at it. It has a church steeple on the town. So there's a legend on these older maps that will tell you what had churches and what did not. These little dots don't have them. The ones with crosses do. And so that's another way for me to tell what type of church and how big it was. Michelschutz has one as well down here. And so that helps me understand, okay, so I've got some up here, some down this way, but these little tiny ones don't have them. And so sometimes the older maps will actually show you that. This is where they had it. But on Wikipedia, the history of the town itself will tell you when they first had certain things. The oldest church was built here, And so if I'm before that time, I'm like, all right, I need the next bigger town up. What town did they belong to? And then I try to figure out that. Does that make sense? But this is another way to figure out, oh, there's churches here and here. I need to look at these. Might be, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
It might be a little too specific, but Ellen and I were talking about our Mennonite ancestors. And two things. One, I had always been confused by the spelling of what I thought was a German name, but didn't seem German to me because it had two A's and two S's in it, Clausen. And that seemed like it would be Dutch or Belgian or something. But they always, when I looked at where people were born, they were born in Prussia. And how, is there a repository of strictly Mennonite overseas kinds of things? Because I know a lot of Dutch or Netherlands Mennonites went to Russia, went to Germany, and then and Poland, and then on to Russia. And I wouldn't even know where to begin to look for those.
You know, there probably is.
A what?
There probably is. That's a specific enough thing. There's got to be someone who's done a website on it. I haven't personally researched in that zone.
Yeah.
I do know that like Clausen, is it CLAASS?
Yes.
So that is very much the Dutch spelling.
Yeah.
But in German, that'd be KLASSEN, Clausen. You know, they have the same surname. It's just spelled slightly differently. So who knows, you know, at what point did what go where? Did spellings change? And you go far enough back, the German surnames that begin with a K start beginning with a C because they were still using the C back then. And so I've seen that a lot as well. Carolina becomes with a C, and I've seen the surname start to have the C on it instead of the K if you go far enough back. And so there's a point at which they didn't diverge. Yeah.
For those who haven't made the switch over into the chatbots, okay, for years we've said you can always Google something like that. okay, Mennonite records in Prussia or whatever, okay? Now, if you use Google and you ask to attach to it BARD, B-A-R-D, which is the chat bot that goes with Google, what will happen was you get the same thing you used to get, but at the top it will give you the option of doing a AI search, artificial intelligence search, okay? In which case it will do the digging down for you, okay? And sometimes that's quite instructive, in particularly that kind of a question, which is a history of the Mennonites in Prussia or whatever. Well, next time you get on your computer, when you open up Google, say connect to Bard or something like that, and it'll give you the instructions about how to, and then Bard will be part of your search routine thereafter. B-A-R-D, Bard.
Jeff, I'm sorry. I did have a cold a couple of weeks ago. I guess that's it. Okay, that's fantastic. So I will try that. There was an earlier diaspora from Germany and Prussia or whatever that wound up in the 1600s in the Netherlands. And then they were part of a Queen Anne group that was going to go to New York. And they were Lutheran. Is that, I know the religions tended to be, because they were outliers more than inliers, and that's why they were all leaving.
Well, Lutheran was in the Western German states, that is the dominant faith.
Right.
And in the Eastern ones, Catholicism is. So they, depending on where one was.
Yeah.
There's quite a few Lutheran records still intact that are even searchable now. And one of the things they would do is, okay, what is that in English? On and Toffel. Family book, like a family tree book. That's what it is. What is that in English? And they would sometimes keep those in the church records where they would list like, this is the whole family, and have these kind of trees going through. I've seen some of those in some of the Lutheran records that are just the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And we'll give the whole like generation upon generation going back, which is fun. And so depending on what part of Germany they're from, that may actually be the dominant faith. They're on the Western side.
I do have a specific name, and it looked like half the group was that name. So I can probably find at least one of them where they were born and go back from there. So, okay. Thank you very much.
Wendy, I know you do some assistance to people at the Family History Center.
I do.
Do you have a scheduled time or how?
I'm there on Saturdays unless I'm teaching.
Okay.
I do teach, a block out of each semester at the university. And so I'll be gone for usually like a few weeks when I do that, but then I'm back. So
But if someone were to call the Family History Center,
they can find me.
they'll tell you whether or not you're going to be there.
Yep. And I show up and we dig through stuff. And most of the time people just come and say, what does this say? I found it. What does it say? And we go through it together and try to decipher it. I'm always happy to do that.
Okay. Any more questions? Online? Okay. Wendy,
right.
Thank you so
This was
much.
fun.
That was
Thank you, guys.
excellent.
Thank you, Zoomies.